Good day and welcome back to the Johnson Space Center for the traditional post-landing press conference for the just completed STS-71 mission. I'll introduce each of our participants this afternoon, and they'll each make brief statements and then we'll throw it open for questions. To my immediate right is Brewster Shaw, who's the director of the Space Shuttle program. To his right is Wayne Hale, who oversaw the entry activities today, also watched over Atlantis' ascent on Tuesday a week ago. And to his right is Dr. Tom Sullivan, who is the STS-71 mission scientist. Again, we'll hear from each one and then we'll take questions.
Thank you. Well, it's a delight to be here after the successful completion of STS-71. My congratulations to Wayne and his entry team for a flawless entry morning, just as the rest of the flight gone. I'm glad that the weather cooperated with us this morning and we were able to get Atlantis back on the ground in Florida. That gives us 6 extra days to get the vehicle turned around, which we can well use since we have a tight schedule to get it prepared for STS-74, the second Mir docking mission later this year. Of course, we'll be back in Florida next week for the launch of STS-70 on Thursday, followed shortly thereafter by 69, and then 3 more flights spaced out through the rest of the year to finish off the 8 flights that we have planned for this calendar year, and we look forward to all of those just as we enjoyed STS-71. Okay, Wayne.
Well, the entry today was rather uneventful. There were no problems with the orbiter. Everything worked perfectly well. The crew flew, as nearly as we can tell in quick look data, a flawless entry. We only watched the weather at the Cape. Weather in Florida is always fun to keep track of, but it turned out to be good enough for us to land. And we were happy to be able to do that, to get the crew back with their families on the first rev. First opportunity to land at the Kennedy Space Center and to let them go on and do some more science post-landing. That's really about all I've got today.
Okay, Tom.
Well, the science team couldn't be happier about how things turned out. Overall, we were able to accomplish about 10% more science activity than we went into the mission planning to do. And I know those scientists are really waiting with bated breath to get their hands on those samples, which they consider to be extremely valuable. The crew was brought down safely. That represents the 3 most important samples we could bring down. We completed the crew exchange. The Mir 19 crew is going to be up there doing more science for our program over the next few months. And of course the Mir 18 crew right now is being brought over to provide additional studies for the next few hours at Cape Kennedy, and they'll be returned to the Johnson Space Center for follow-up studies to be done over the next few weeks. We were really thrilled that over the course of the Mir 18 and the STS-71 program, and now going into the Mir 19 program, we've been able to accomplish about 28 investigations over an interdisciplinary program. We did a little bit of everything. We had a space lab mission, we transferred samples, we had a rendezvous and docking, practicing for the way we're going to do science in this era of the space station program. So we couldn't be happier. We're looking forward to seeing the crew back here and getting them back into their 1G environment.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen. We'll start with questions here and then head to KSC and other centers if required. Mark, you have a question?
This is Mark Carreau, the Houston Chronicle, for Tom Sullivan. Do you have any sort of a preliminary report on the 2 cosmonauts and Norm Thagard? And when about will they leave Kennedy for Johnson? And will the specimen samples and so forth be on that plane as well, or will they come here later?
Well, I don't have any report on the cosmonauts. I do know that President Clinton called Norm Thagard today, and it sounded like he was feeling fine. He sounded great. So from all I can tell based on that, I think everything's great, and I presume the cosmonauts are doing fine also. They're being taken over to the baseline data collection facility, as it's called, over at the Cape for a few hours of studies, and these studies will repeat some of the sessions that they performed on orbit during Mir 18, and also that they performed before launch while they were still in Moscow. They will be arriving sometime later this evening. I don't know the precise time. And the samples that you asked about, the frozen samples will be returned on a separate plane. I believe that will also come in tonight. The rest of the data on tapes and things like that will be brought back, I believe, on yet another plane later on.
Anything else, Mark? Okay, let's go to the Kennedy Space Center now.
This is Phil Chen, Earth News for Brewster. You talked about it a little bit in your opening remarks. Can you talk about how difficult it is to schedule 3 missions so quickly, especially in today's budget environment, and how difficult it is on the various teams to be able to get the mission so close to each other?
Well, of course, we didn't schedule these missions so close together. It was just the way it worked out due to a lot of influences largely out of our control. The fact that they are all ready to go makes the carrying out or conducting of the launches and the missions not terribly stressful for us. All of the hardware is prepared and it's come along on schedule. We will launch these missions and fly them, and that will be able to be supported by the launch teams and the flight control teams, and we expect things to go just as well on the next 2 flights as they have on 71. So the fact that they ended up flying close together is really not terribly stressful for us. If we had to process them all in the same period of time, that would have been a different matter, but it just turned out that this is when we're able to fly them.
And for Wayne, can you talk about the weather-making decisions this morning? Seems like this is the cloudiest KSC landing I can remember. And did you have any external pressure because of all the VIPs over here today to see this particular landing here?
Well, I'll answer the second part first. No, there was no additional pressure. That had absolutely nothing to do with the decision. Of course, we knew that we wanted to return the crew as soon as possible so that they could get back home and get on with the science and those sort of things. But those aren't the sort of considerations that really drive the decision-making process. The decision-making process today was no different than it is on any other shuttle flight. You know, first of all, we want to make sure we make a safe decision to land when the weather is acceptable so that the pilot can see all the ground landmarks that he needs to see and so on and so forth. Secondly, we'd always like to get back to the Cape whenever that's practical and save the expense and the time delay involved in the ferry flight. And thirdly, of course, we would like to land as soon as possible when our mission profile is complete, when all the science is done and the mission scientist said he's done with everything that he needs to do. Then it's time to get back on the ground, turn the vehicle around and get ready for the next flight. That's kind of the priority scheme. And there was no additional pressure today. It did turn out to be a tad bit cloudier, and that's what we had to watch, but it was clearly acceptable. We talked a lot to Bob Cabana, the chief of the astronaut office, as he was flying the shuttle training aircraft, and he gave us a clear indication that we had a good runway set up from looking at those ground landmarks that we were talking about earlier. And from every consideration we had, it was a safe landing, and it was really not a very hard decision at all.
This is Todd Halverson of Florida Today for Dr. Sullivan. I know you don't have any preliminary data on the Mir 18 crew, but can you give us an idea from previous long-term space flights what that crew might be feeling in terms of physical manifestations upon their re-entering normal gravity?
Well, sure. Quite often the people who have been up there for a long time, and sometimes not even all that long, feel a little lightheaded when they stand up. Of course, they haven't had the force of gravity pulling the blood down to the bottom of their body, so when they stand up, it's as if you stood up too fast upon waking up in the morning. Sometimes we feel a little lightheaded, and that's usually the main thing for short term. For long term, they might have a little muscle weakness and perhaps some general tiredness. And other than that, it's quite often just up to the individual.
This is Seth Bornstein from the Orlando Sentinel. I know this is also a little early, but the Mir 18 crew, Did they go out on stretchers as planned, or did any of them stand up and walk out to the crew transport on their own? And have you got plans, Dr. Sullivan, and is there a planned menu already for Norm Thagard's first meal home, and does it include the hot fudge sundae? Or?
Well, Seth, I don't know if he's going to get a hot fudge sundae or not. We joked about that earlier. Quite frankly, I don't know if any of the three crews, three long-duration crew, stood up. We had requested that they stay sitting, or excuse me, supine, lying down, so that it would maintain the adaptation to zero-G as best we can here on Earth. Once you sit up or stand up, you really do fairly quickly start to readapt, and the scientists have requested that they stay laying down to minimize that adaptation until we can start to measure it and follow its progress. But I just hadn't heard whether or not they stood up. There was a plan to request their stand-up in the crew transfer vehicle as a test, and that was only on a voluntary basis, and really don't know if they did it or not.
This is Jim Banky of Florida Today. A question first for Dr. Sullivan. Could you review what you'll be doing with Norm and the two cosmonauts during, the next 3 weeks, 6 months, what your long-term examination program is? And also, in that answer, tell me when everyone goes back home for good, including the cosmonauts back to Russia.
Well, this is a plan that we've been working on and negotiating with the Russians and the astronaut office and a host of other folks for quite some time now. But it's one that we realize we're going to have to adjust every day based on how the crew is doing. The flight surgeons will be evaluating the crew rehabilitation. There will be calls just based on the tiredness of the crew. They may not be willing to participate, and we certainly want to take that into account. But the plans start pretty much once they get on the crew transfer vehicle. There was to be a stand test to see how well they can stand. We're going to get them back to the baseline data collection facility at the Cape and do some quick tests on them in terms of the metabolic studies, such as were performed on the second full day of docking activities. And that involved some stable isotope tests involving calcium to see how the bone metabolism goes, to see how the fluid levels in the body go. They were going to drink some other stable isotopes. And then following that up with the same thing we've been talking about all week, blood draws and urine samples and saliva samples. There will also be some investigations on how well their balance mechanisms have recovered and how well their cardiovascular systems recover. And this will be just a portion of their time over the next few weeks. We're giving them some days off, plenty of time to rest and exercise to try to get back to 1G. And of course the technical debriefs that will go on to ask them how the mission went and all of the input that they would like to pass on so that the people who follow can benefit from their experience.
When do the cosmonauts go back to Russia?
Well, the last I heard, and again, this is not negotiable, was that there were about 2 to 3 weeks of activities planned here. We were then going to give them about a week of vacation time so that they could really get back with their families. After that, there would be 3 or 4 more days at the Cape, and then they would return. So that totals up to about a month and a half, something like that.
Okay, and I got a question for Brewster on the turnaround time between now and next Thursday. Are you in any way rushed to get off next Thursday? And could you describe how you turn around the shuttle program to fly again, what you'll be doing in the next 6 days, and whether this short turnaround time is a pain at all?
No, I don't think I would call it a pain. We are ready to pick up the count after this weekend's activities. We'll be ready Monday to pick up the count for a launch on Thursday. Do we have to launch next Thursday? No, we do not. But if the hardware's ready, the crew's ready, and the weather is cooperative, then we will be ready to fly, and we'll launch next Thursday and get on with STS-70. There's not really anything that we have to do unusual in the program to support that.
Bill Horowitz, CBS News. Gosh, Brewster, I was expecting you to say that you were just terribly pained by that. No, but seriously. Looking at these flights, I realize that the hardware happens to be ready and the schedule just shook out this way.
At the same time, you guys are launching these 3 flights coming up. The Russians, of course, have a Progress launch. The Mir 20 crew is going to get launched. They've got 3 spacewalks scheduled. There's a lot of activity on both sides of the ocean, all focusing back down to late October, early November when you launch the second docking mission. Is this kind of pace purely coincident, or is it the kind of thing we can expect in the space station construction era, that sort of thing, with this level of activity?
Well, I think our level of activity will remain relatively constant. We have 7 flights a year planned for the foreseeable future. When you start to observe 2 space programs, of course the level of activity goes up by probably a factor of 2 or more. So it seems like there's a lot going on, and indeed there is. But with respect to our own program, the level of activity, I think, is going to be pretty much the same. There are additional things involved, of course, in flying cooperative international flights, and there's a lot of extra activities that go on to support those. But from the standpoint of flying 7 flights a year, we're going to fly 7 flights a year.
This is Sue Butler for Dr. Sullivan. I came in late on this, so maybe you have already addressed it, but how concerned are you about radiation? Weren't our guys, wasn't Dr. Sagat and the Russians wearing dosimeters up there, and what were the readings, and how concerned are you about radiation during prolonged space flight?
Well, the crew was wearing radiation dosimeters. As a matter of fact, they were wearing one from the Russian program and one from the U.S. program, so that we can start to compare the data between the 2 sides and make sure that there's nothing that either side is overlooking. In low Earth orbit, radiation is a concern, but it's not as great a concern as it would be once we go onward to the moon or to Mars. We can deal with radiation through the shielding of the spacecraft, and the more shielding the better, but we do monitor the exposure of the crew so that we do not exceed the limits that we feel would be healthy. And the flight surgeons and folks are keeping an eye on that on all crew.
Pete Galtieri with the West Kentucky News. How late in the timeline was the runway changed, and how does that compare with other flights, and what's the latest you can do it? If you can answer that, please.
Sure. We changed runways based on Bob Cabana's report from the STA about 25 minutes before landing. That's probably the 5th or 6th time we've done that sort of thing in recent memory. And we can change it as late as about 10 minutes prior to landing without causing any real problems to our trajectory. We'd like to get on with that a little bit earlier. And the primary consideration today, of course, was which end of the runway, since they were both acceptable to use, which end of the runway gave the pilot the best scene coming up on the navigation aids, and that was about 25 minutes before landing.
Was that the latest that you've ever done that?
Oh no, we have redesignated later. I would be hard pressed to tell you the late record, but no, we've done that at later times than we did today.
I have one question for Brewster also, if you can answer it. Early next week, the range is going to be busy down here at KSC with the Air Force. If they get delayed, how's that going to affect the 70 launch?
I don't remember exactly the range schedule, but I can describe the process and the agreements that we have. When you get scheduled on the range protects 2 tries for you, 2 days in a row. So if you scrub the first day, then you get to try again the next day. And if the next day for the activity on the range happens to conflict with our first try, then we would get bumped to the right. And the same thing would happen if we're trying and somebody's behind us.
Brewster, this is Todd Halverson of Florida Today. That Titan launch is scheduled for Monday, so I'm assuming that if they slip to Tuesday, that you would take a 1-day hit on Discovery. Is that correct?
I really don't know what's on the range ahead of us next week, so I really can't answer that. But the process I just described to you is the way it works.
Last one for Brewster. The second Mir docking mission is scheduled for October 26th, but you guys are obviously a couple weeks down on your OPF flow. Can you tell us what the status of that October 26th launch date is, if you anticipate you're going to take a hit to that date, or whether you're going to be working overtime to meet that date?
Right now, we don't have any reason to move off of that date. I think in the next flow, the long pole is turning the docking module or the airlock with a docking mechanism around to get it prepared for the configuration we'll be flying on STS-74. And we will be working pretty much around the clock on doing that turnaround to modify the airlock with the docking mechanism that is configured to mate with the docking module, which will mate with the mirror. And of course, we'll leave the docking module up there and use that docking port from then on. So I think that's the long pole. I think right now the schedule fits, and we're planning to fly on the 26th of October as planned.
Okay, let's head to Washington, D.C. for a couple of questions, then back here to wrap up.
Yes, this is Washington. Yes, this is A.R. Hogan, Writers Plus Newsroom. We thought we heard something about a large tile had fallen off during the landing. Can you tell us about that? And there's one more question.
Probably what people are talking about is the door that covers the drag chute that gets blown off each time we deploy the drag chute. And in today's landing, you could see that bouncing down along the runway, I think off to the right side of the runway behind the vehicle. And that's a normal process.
And my other question is probably for Brewster Shaw. This is for Brewster Shaw. Are you at all disappointed that this historic mission did not get the media coverage that something of this magnitude would be expected to get? There's just one little paragraph in this week's Newsweek, and just a 3-page article in Time magazine, for example. Were you really disappointed that it didn't get the coverage after all these decades of the space race that you might have expected? And that's from Washington.
I don't know where you personally have been over the last 10 days, and I'm not familiar with your personal reading selection, but from down here there was a tremendous amount of coverage as we saw it. It was on the news and in the papers every day, so I think we got a lot of coverage.
I might add something to that too, Brewster. We have an internet page on the internet for this mission, and somewhere mid-mission I heard that we had about 2.5 million inquiries, so it seems to me there was a great deal of interest out there.
Okay, that's it from Washington and AR. By the way, that number's up to 2.8 million. Mark has one wrap-up question, and then we'll wrap this up.
This is Mark Carreau from the Houston Chronicle for Brewster Shaw. Atlanta seemed to perform very admirably, but I wonder if there was anything that you know of that might sort of add to the docking module changes, or anything about the construct of the 74 flight itself, and maybe specifically if the undocking episode where Mir lost its attitude control, or any of that will fit into mission planning at this point that you'll have to do to be ready for that flight.
I don't think so, Mark. The only thing that I'm aware of that we learned from this mission that we may take some action on is when we depressed the vestibule and prior to the undocking. The depress took longer because the flow of air out of the vestibule wasn't as anticipated. So we may do some slight modifications to improve that so that it depresses in the normal amount of time that we would expect per the design. Other than that, we only had, I think, 5 in-flight anomalies that are being carried against the vehicle. None of them have anything to do with the docking, the mated operations. So I don't think that we're going to have to do very much different in preparation for STS 74. The problem with the control of the Mir spacecraft after undocking, I think, is something that the Russians will deal with and rectify before the next flight, and the fact that there'll be a crew on board during the next undocking will also go a long way towards preventing that type of problem.
Okay, I'd like to make a couple of quick announcements before wrapping this up. We're going to switch back to the Kennedy Space Center now for a press briefing with NASA Administrator Daniel Golden and Russian Space Agency Director General Yuri Kopchev. That will be at KSC. It will be on NASA television, but the questions will only come from KSC. That will be followed about 4 o'clock this afternoon Central or 5 o'clock Eastern Time by a crew post-landing press conference. That will be Commander Hoot Gibson plus any of the other available crew members from the STS-71 crew. The Mir-18 crew members will not be part of that. The 71 crew members also will return to Houston about 9 o'clock tonight. The routine crew return ceremony will be held at Ellington Field here in Houston, again, roughly 9 p.m. this evening. That time obviously is subject to change. Thank you very much.